The topic for today, introduction to the idea that we are responsible for other people's mitzvos. We're not only responsible for our own mitzvos, we're responsible for other people's mitzvos. And this idea has roots in various places. One is a root in a certain type of moral idea, and the other is a root in a certain type of Jewish idea, which I think you could probably call mystical. I want to start with the moral idea, and then I'll get to the mystical idea, either today or tomorrow. Here's a thought which is very intuitive, very natural. One of the greatest of the modern philosophers made a big deal out of this thought, and that is, you can't be obligated to do something that's impossible for you. To say you have an obligation, say you ought to do something, when it's something that's impossible, is just a mistake. Immanuel Kant pushed this idea. The aphorism that expresses it is, ought implies can. If you say somebody ought to do something, that presupposes that he can do it. And you can easily imagine, you say, why didn't you do that? You say, I couldn't. It was not possible for me to do it. And that seems to be an adequate answer. Okay, since you couldn't do it. But that's not the only way to do it. That's not the only way to work it. An alternative is to say, you do have the obligation. Even if you're not able to do it, you're obligated to do it, but if you fail, there's no fault. There's no criticism. There's no guilt. There's no penalty. So you have obligations that you have, and then there are two possible ways to fail. One is if you decide, I'm not doing that, that's a decided failure. It's a chosen failure, and they're responsible for it. Then there could be consequences. Or you could fail and say, I couldn't help it. If you couldn't help it, you shouldn't suffer any penalties, but that doesn't mean that you weren't responsible to do it. For example, let's take a speed limit. Speed limit is 55 miles an hour. Now let's suppose you're doing 52, and suddenly the gas pedal, you have the car hits something on the ground, and your foot juggles up back and forth and slams down the accelerator, and you end up doing 70. Well, when the cop pulls you over, you say, listen, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I hit a barrier and my foot went down on the pedal. So you could say, oh, well, if you hit a barrier and your foot went down and you couldn't control it, then you had the speed limit didn't apply to you. Or you could say, yeah, the speed limit applies to everybody. 55 is the limit for everybody. But you went over by accident, so you don't deserve any penalties, because it was just an accident. And there's a big difference between these two ideas. I think the Torah, as I'll show you, agrees with the second idea, not with the first idea. Let's imagine a situation like this. Reuven borrows money, and he signs a note to pay it at the end of the year. And when he borrows it, he has a bank account, and he has a house, and he's got a job, and he just needs the money for an immediate expense, and there shouldn't be any problem. He's got collateral. He's a good risk. By the end of the year, his house burned down, and the insurance company went broke, and he's got a relative who was taken care of in the hospital, and so forth and so on. At the end of the year, he can't pay. Now, I have money, and I could give him my money so he can pay the loan. Should I do that? Is there any reason for doing that? Is there any benefit for doing that? Let's look at it through Kant's eyes. Through Kant's eyes, he borrowed the money, and now he can't pay it. It's impossible for him to pay it. So if it's impossible to pay it, he has no obligation to pay it. According to Kant, he has no obligation. So why should I give him the money? He's fine. He's morally perfect. Everything's perfect in his life. There are no failures, no demerits. He has no obligation. So there's nothing wrong. But if he has an obligation to pay, it's just that he can't, but the obligation is still there, then by my giving him the money, he can now fulfill the obligation that applies to him. That makes the world a better place. A person who's not fulfilling an obligation means morally the world is missing something. And I'm making it possible for the world to be fulfilled. So if you say that obligations are not dependent upon your ability, only your responsibility for failure is dependent upon your ability, then there's a reason to be responsible for other people's obligations. Because you make the world a better place if you enable someone to fulfill an obligation that he's at present unable to fulfill. And that is Jewish law in spades. This happens to people often. Comes Sukkot, and you have to have a lulav at esrog. For some people, it's very expensive. There were times when the Rav of the city would have the only lulav and esrog in the whole city, and he would use it for the mitzvah, and he would put it on the table, and everyone in the congregation would come up and use it to make them, because they just couldn't afford it. Right? No one said, well, let's see, I've got my lulav and esrog, it's mine. Right? They don't have, so they have no mitzvah to take it. They're not obligated to take it, so they're not missing anything. So why should I give mine to them? No, on the contrary. They are obligated, and the fact that they don't have means they can't fulfill their obligation. And if I lend mine to them, they can fulfill their obligation, and the world is a better place. Yeah.
So the principle only applies if the person can't, for whatever reason, is physically unable to fulfill, or mentally, but physically unable to fulfill their obligation.
Yeah. Okay. Right. So now that's, I think, a moral background for it, especially if you don't take the Kantian position, you take the other position. The Gemara expresses this, the famous Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which reads like this. I'm dramatizing it, but this is what the point that the Gemara is making. It's Friday night, and you're at a place where they're having the meal, and whoever's the host gets up and makes kiddush, and you wash, make hamotzi, you're sitting down, you're eating the soup, and you're singing and conversing, and there's a knock on the door. So the host opens the door, and there's a stranger standing there, and he says, I need your help. I don't have any wine. I need to fulfill the mitzvah of kiddush. Please make kiddush for me. Well, let's see. How's that going to work? The way it's done, typically, you've all seen this, is that one person makes kiddush and everybody else satisfies obligation by listening. But there's a rule for this to work. The person who's saying the words has to be fulfilling the mitzvah. He can't be play acting. Can't be just reciting syllables. He has to be fulfilling the mitzvah. And then the listeners fulfill their obligation by attaching themselves to his mitzvah. Now, let's see. The mitzvah of Kiddush is once a week, Friday night. The mitzvah of Deraisa is once a week, Friday night. He made Kiddush already. So, yeah, he could say the words again, but at least starting out, it's not doing the mitzvah because he doesn't have an obligation anymore. He fulfilled his obligation already. So the first thought is, of course he can't do that. Now, that doesn't mean you abandon the stranger. You can give him his own cup of wine. If you need to, you can say the words, and he can say the words after you. It's just that this legal connection that one person says the words, the other person satisfies the obligation, requires the person saying the words to be fulfilling his obligation, and that's just not available. That's the first thought. But the Gemara says it can be done. So Rashi on the spot says, because Kol Yisrael Arevim Zelazah. All Jews are responsible for one another. That's what Rashi says. But when you think about it, it's not obvious how that fills the gap. Again, when he knocks on the door and he asks about Kiddush, I'm not going to abandon him. I'm not going to close the door in his face. I'm responsible for him. I definitely will help him. I'll give him his own cup of wine, and I'll say the words for him, or give him a text to say the words, or teach him the words. I'm going to help him. It's just that the legal connection of my saying the words for him, that seems to be impossible because I don't have to do the mitzvah anymore. So it's not obvious how Rashi's words alone fill the gap. The Ran expands on Rashi's words. The Ran says something really quite remarkable. He says, if there's any Jew in the world who hasn't made Kiddush, then the mitzvah is still alive, and the mitzvah is still alive for anybody who could do it for him. So when he knocks on my door, let's say I'm the host, he knocks on my door, and he says he needs help with Kiddush, that resurrects my mitzvah. That resurrects my mitzvah because my mitzvah includes a responsibility for everyone's Kiddush in the world. In other words, instead of defining the mitzvah of Kiddush as each person should make Kiddush, you could define the mitzvah of Kiddush in social terms. Each person should do everything that's possible so that every Jew shall have made Kiddush. That's what the mitzvah is. So that when he knocks on the door, in fact, my mitzvah is now renewed, and when I do it, I'm doing my mitzvah. Indeed, in Europe, when a person was a rav of a city, and there were usually, in a Jewish population, there were widows, and it came the night of the Seder, and the widows often couldn't conduct a Seder for themselves. The rav would go from house to house and conduct a Seder in each house before he came home to his family in the middle of the night to conduct it for them. And in each house he made Kiddush again. In each house he said all the brachos again. Because as long as they need it, his mitzvah is renewed. That's what the Ran says. So the Ran is already telling me something crucial about the very nature of a mitzvah. The very nature of the mitzvah has this social dimension built in. Yes, it comes from a second pasuk, and maybe it was only at the Choriv that it took place before they came into Eretz Yisrael. It took place when Arvis came in, but that's the bottom line. The bottom line is that the mitzvahs have this social dimension, and therefore we are responsible for each other's mitzvahs. That's what the Ran says. So the Ran is filling in sort of the legal background for Rashi. The Ritva fills in what I would call the metaphysical or mystical background. The Ritva says the whole of the Jewish people forms a single entity. We are all parts of a single compound entity. And therefore, it isn't someone else's mitzvah. We are, in fact, all parts of the same person. And that's why it's responsible. They're responsible for the other person. Responsible because it's not really somebody else. And am I responsible for his responsibilities as opposed to my responsibilities? Dividing it up that way is artificial. If you would ask the right hand what its feelings are about an affection on the left hand, it wouldn't say, oh, well, I don't know, I'm the right hand and that's the left hand. Who knows? Maybe on Thursdays and so forth and so on. There's one bloodstream joining the two of them. There's an affection on the left hand, the right hand's just as much danger. Not going to get away without it. The hands are dedicated to the success of the whole of which they're a part. So, it's not a sacrifice for the hand to put a bandage on the foot. It's caring for the same whole of which they're both parts. So the Ritva is taking Rashi's idea and explaining it in metaphysical terms, and this gives a very, very deep picture of what it means to be responsible for someone else's mitzvahs. Yeah.
With stuff like teshuva, how does that work? Can you make teshuva on someone else's behalf? Can you go and apologize to someone that they've wronged on their behalf? Surely that doesn't make sense.
Right. So it does not make sense. Well, almost. I'll talk about that in detail in a second. The idea, but let's take your idea and transpose it to our situation, because there are legal rules here. Let's say instead of my making Kiddush and other people listening, let's say someone wants to appoint me his shaliach, his agent, to make Kiddush for him, and he'll go to sleep. That doesn't work. That doesn't work. So the fact that we are responsible for one another doesn't mean that there aren't legal restrictions as to how to act out the responsibility. There will be legal restrictions as to how to act out the responsibility. You know, somebody asks for money on Friday night, I tell him come back Saturday night. I'm not going to give him money on Saturday, unless he's dying. But otherwise, he's just asking for charity because I am responsible for him, but I can't give it to him on Shabbos. So the very fact that I'm responsible doesn't mean that any imaginative interaction would be kosher. So here, in the case of tshuva, my responsibility would be to impress upon him the necessity of doing tshuva, to encourage him, to try to inspire him, to give him literature about doing tshuva. That's true in general. But there is a case which is much more direct. There's a mitzvah of vidui, of saying confession. Usually, saying confession is an elaborate affair. You have to say what you did, and you have to say that you regret having done it, to say that I resolve not to repeat it in the future. You address all that to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But when it comes to Yom Kippur, the Sfarim say the vidui, the confession of Yom Kippur, is 4 words. Aval anachnu va'avoseinu chatanu. Aval here means in truth, doesn't mean but. Sometimes aval means in truth and not but. You have to pay attention sometimes. In truth, we and our ancestors have sinned. So here we are saying vidui for them. So now you have to ask, how does that work? Not just the fact that we're responsible, how does it work? And the answer of how it works, this is very, very relevant to what the Mitzvah says, is that the Jewish people is a single people. There are a lot of individuals, but a single people. You know what? Let me show you this inside. Take the blue books, and I'll show you this inside. Since you raised it. And show you also how to read carefully. This is on page 1087, Parshas Nitzavim. Now here the English doesn't do what the Hebrew does, so I have to fill it in for you. So you'll have to. Sorry? If you read Hebrew, you can read it in Hebrew. It'll be even better.
It's 187, sorry.
No, 1087.
1087.
Toward the end of the book. Okay, so now I'm going to say singular and plural, and you'll notice where the changes take place. And I'll read it this way. You, all of you, because in the Hebrew it's plural. You, all of you, are standing today, all of you, before Hashem. You and all of you, God. The heads of you and all of your tribes. You and all of your elders. You and all of your officers. All the men of Israel. You and all of your small children, you and all of your women, and the convert who's in the midst of your singular camp, from the your of the draw of your wood singular, the draw of your water singular. For you singular. To pass into the covenant of Hashem your God and into his curse, that Hashem your God singular seals with you today, in order to establish you singular today as a people to him. He shall be a God to you. As he has spoken to you singular, and swore to your fathers, the your is singular, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's all singular. Now 13 switches back. Not with you all alone do I seal this covenant and this curse, but whoever is here, standing with us today, our God, and whoever is not here with us today. So it starts plural, moves to singular, and then goes back to plural. Very peculiar phraseology for this passage. Well, let's think what's going on here. God, through Moses, is speaking to the people, and he's saying, I'm entering into a covenant, an agreement. I'm offering you my side, and I want you to agree. And when we agree, then it's going to be binding on all future generations. How does that work exactly? If my father worked for IBM, signed a contract, got a salary, when he retires, do I have to work for IBM? What's the fact that my father agreed to work for IBM? What's that got to do with me? Why should the fact that those Jews, 3,300 years ago, those Jews standing at Sinai said yes, why should that bind future generations? Now let's look back at the text, and I'll show you what the text explains this. You, all of you are standing here, all plural, you and your children and everything else. Skip to 11. For you, singular, to pass into the covenant of his God, in order to establish you today as a people to him. You, population of many individuals, form a people, a single people. God is not making the covenant with each of the Jews who was alive at that time. God is making a covenant with the Jewish people, which continues to exist even when individuals die and new Jews are born and join the population. It's the same people. And because you are a single people, therefore, when you say yes to your future generations, and that includes, as it says at the end of the passage, even people who aren't here. Now, you're all familiar with this. The United States, let's say, signed a treaty with Mexico in 1906. And it's still on the books. Does it bind me? Couldn't I say, look, I didn't vote for those representatives. I didn't vote for the president or the senators who signed it. I'm a new generation. What's it got to do with me? Ask me if I want that treaty. Or ask my population, if my generation, they want that treaty. That's not true. Because it's not a nation with the Americans alive at the time. It's a treaty with a nation, and it's the same nation. The same nation of America as it was in 1906. It's just that different people formed the nation. And this is true in corporate life also. If General Motors will sign a contract with Zaire to supply them with tractors for 25 years, well, as the years go by, the CEO is replaced, and the president and the other officers are replaced, and the shares of stock are sold, and there are other people who own the shares of stock. By year 17, no one is associated with the company that was associated when this contract was signed 17 years ago. Can they say, well, then the contract's not binding? Because we're not General Motors. We're just different people. So, on the contrary, you're different people, but the corporation still exists. It's still the same corporation. General Motors didn't go out of business. They didn't declare bankruptcy. So you, as the same corporation, are responsible to fulfill the obligations that were contracted 17 years ago when General Motors signed that contract with Zaire. So the picture here is that the nation as a whole continues through time. The phraseology in the Talmud for this is Ein Tzibur Meis. The Tzibur doesn't die. Individual members die and they're replaced by other people, but the tzibur doesn't die. So now, on Yom Kippur, when you're confessing, what are you confessing? I had a great-great-grandfather named Ruvain who lived in Poland 250 years ago. Am I confessing his sins? No, that I can't do, just like you said. Confession is part of tshuva. Tshuva has to be done by every individual. But if I'm confessing the failures of the Am, of the nation, then this stage of the nation can say on the transgressions of the previous stage of the same Am. I heard this first from Rabbi Soloveitchik in Boston, maybe 50 years ago, and he mentioned that when the second temple was built, sacrifices were offered to atone for the idol worship of the first temple. 70 years went by. Perhaps there were a few survivors from that time, but the vast majority were not there. But it was for the fact that the Jewish people, 100 years before, had worshipped idols. This segment of the Jewish people has to can do tshuva for that and can atone for that because they're a continuation of the same the same people, rather the same nation, rather than just individuals. Yeah.
Then why are people punished / rewarded individually? So if kind of the idea is that we're all one people and that we all have responsibility over each other, how is that individual punishment and reward?
Okay, so you see, I hear now you're taking what I said, but you're hearing it a little too strong.
Right.
A person can simultaneously be a part of a larger whole and also have significance as an individual. I'll give you an example for that. By the way, I'm giving an example from biology now. There are many, many, many parallelisms between Torah structure ideas and the physical world. Many. The more we discover, the more take, for example, an individual cell in your body. There are lots of different kinds of cells in the body. Just to bring you up to date, the loose common wisdom was there are about maybe 200 different types of cells. Well, recently they revised that to 3,000 different types. That's the new thinking. There are 3,000 different types of cells in your body, of the trillions of cells that make you up. Trillions. And that's a challenge because they have hundreds of people doing research all over the world on cell types and cell characteristics. And the people, I heard this on the BBC, they had a review of this research, and the evidence is so vast that only, you're sitting down, only AI I got enough resources to analyze it. Well, if you know AI the way I know AI, I wouldn't trust the outcome. I wouldn't trust it at all. AI can make awful, awful, awful mistakes. And no human being can check it because it's just too gigantic amount of information. I'd be very, very skeptical about trusting the outcome. At any rate, so think of the cells. Now you have, let's say, a nerve cell and a muscle cell and a skin cell. They look very different, different shape, different sizes, different qualities and characteristics, but they all have the same DNA. They all have the same DNA, exact same DNA. So the DNA traces them back to a common source and links them to this body of which they're a whole. But in this body of which they're a whole, they play different roles. And then a person can have, God forbid, a nerve disease, which isn't a skin disease, it isn't a muscle disease. And then the medicines that he will take will be for the nerves and not for the others, because even though they are parts of a whole, they have individual character also. I once wrote a paper, and I published it in a certain journal, arguing for the corporate nature of the Jewish nation, and I was ignorant of the fact that there are also sources that describe the nature of the individual significance. Only later did I become aware of it, and then I was a little critical of the editors because I was a beginner. That they published the paper without pointing it out to me. But there are sources that stress the corporate nature of the Jewish people, and there are courses that stress the individual nature of each Jew, and they're both true. So you have to balance the two of them together. Yeah.
How can or do Jews even bear responsibility for the Jews who are ignorant or stubborn or especially against Torah ideas, especially in our day and age with the assimilation and Jews being more secular, not interested in Torah life or...
So this is a very interesting point. Bear responsibility. The words bear responsibility are really focused on, and if it isn't carried out, then you're failed, and you're going to be criticized and perhaps penalized for the failure. Well, you're not going to be penalized or for a failure if it was impossible for you to do anything about it. That's what we said against Kant. You can have an obligation, but if it was impossible for you to fulfill the obligation, then you're not penalized for not fulfilling it. Only when it was possible, you made a decision not to do it. And in fact, there are sources. For example, one of the things that you should do when you see a person failing is to call them to account. Now, there are ways to do this. You do it in private, you do it in a friendly way instead of an angry way, and you don't criticize him, you express sympathy for him and so forth and so on. There are ways to do this. If it's done correctly, and he still persists in his bad behavior, then his guilt is worse because he's undergone this kind of warning or reproof. But if I'm not mistaken, it was the Chazon Ish who said, no one today knows how to do that. No one knows how to do it. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make an effort where you think you can make a difference, but that means that if you make the effort and he still persists, he's not going to be guilty like he would have been 1,000 years ago. Because what you did wasn't a fulfillment of what the Torah wants when you actually reprove a person. So you do what you can, and if you do what you can, then you don't bear any more responsibility. The Gemara's way of putting it is, if you could have stopped him, then if you didn't, you had a response. Then you'll be caught in what he did. But if you couldn't have stopped him, and very often these people can't be stopped. There's nothing you could do to stop them. This especially applies in terms of family. We spoke about this a few months ago. Everybody who becomes involved with Yiddishkeit and sees how important it is and how true it is, and has a family of members who don't subscribe to it, feels very disturbed by the fact that they're missing out on this and their lives are subject to terrible losses. But that doesn't mean you're able to do anything about it. And typically you can't, because if you're speaking about your parents, their attitude is, we diapered you. Don't tell us how to live. And if it's an older sibling, if you're 16 and he's 22, he says, I was 16 once, and now I'm 22, so leave me alone. You can't tell me how to live. And if you're 16 and the sibling is 12, the 12-year-old says, you're going your own path, aren't you? You're making your own, leave me alone. I'll do the same thing for myself. So everyone has an excuse why he doesn't want to listen to you. And therefore, you're better off simply saying, this is not my job, because it's not something that I'm able to do. We spoke about the difference between obstacles and tests. So this is an obstacle, it's not a test, because it's not something that you're able to do.
What would your twin say?
Sorry?
What would your twin say?
What would?
Your twin say? It's someone who's also 16 years old.
It's an interesting question. I mean, you mean identical twin,
Yeah.
not a fraternal twin.
Because Rabbi mentioned
What would your identical twin say? The truth is that identical twins share much more than other pairs of people, much more than other siblings. But if the others share 20% and identical twins share 60%, there'll still be 40% that makes them different. So they don't always take the same professions. They don't always have the same political opinions. They don't always wear the same color suits. Sometimes they do. The Minnesota studies did studies on this years ago, and they found, what did I just see now, by the way? The latest thing, what component is more important in the development of intelligence, your genes or the environment? And the latest, this this nature and nurture goes back and forth like a pendulum. But the latest thing is the genes play a greater role than the environment, and this was a lefty source, so then it's got to be true, because it's bad for them. It's bad for them.
So in any case, Rabbi said that this is a test, not an obstacle.
On the other hand, on the other way around, it's an obstacle but not a test. Because there's no way of failing it because you're not able to carry it out. So back to it. So now that then explains the background for why we're responsible for one another. Now let's take a look at some of the places where the corporate nature of the Jewish people shows, and then I'll tell you some of the places where the individual nature of the Jewish people shows. Prayer at a minyan. 10 men should pray together. Why? What difference does it make? Well, the Agadic sources say that God has a special relationship, a special care, a special investment when people pray together as a minyan. An explanation of that, which I heard again from Rabbi Soloveitchik in Boston 1,000,000 years ago, goes like this. Where do we learn 10 from? 10, there's a verse that says, I'll be sanctified among Toch B'nai Yisrael. And there's a link, double link to another verse, which has a description of 10. So sanctifying God is carried out in the presence of 10. What's that other verse? Well, when the 12 spies came back from spying out the land of Israel, and 10 of them gave a bad report. Yeshua and Gottleib gave a good report of the two out of 12. The other 10 came back and gave a bad report. And God says to Moses, how long will this Ada, will this congregation stand before me? And they died. Oh, they called the congregation. And that goes to the idea of sanctified Ada Toch Toch, says that it was sanctified among the Jewish people. That means 10 constitutes an Ada, whatever an Ada is, and that's why it's special. So Rabbi Soloveitchik analyzed it like this. Let's consider what a spy is. What is a spy, and what does a spy do? Well, let's say he takes photographs of forbidden installations. But it's not just that. A person might do that because he didn't see the sign, or because he's a visitor from another country who doesn't read English. He just took a picture of the place. No. A spy is working on behalf of a foreign government to learn secrets of this country so as to put this country at a disadvantage in a conflict between the two governments. If country A sent spies to country B could reply by attacking country A. It's a hostile act. It means it's a national act. The spy isn't going just to see things and take pictures to show his grandchildren. He's acting on behalf of a foreign government. So it's a national act. I'll give you another example. The British ambassador calls up the American Secretary of State and says, how about tennis on Saturday? And the American Secretary of State says, sorry, I'm going fishing, so we'll try another time. Contrast that if the British ambassador says, my government has a note to deliver to the United States government. When will you be in? And he says, I don't know, call me next week, we're not. That's a national insult. Because there, the British ambassador is not calling as someone who wants to go fishing or play tennis. He's calling as a representative of Britain, speaking to the Secretary of State of America as a representative of America. That's when he's playing a national role. So, Rabbi Soloveitchik said, if you're going to learn 10 as a minion from an incident that involves spies, what you're being told is that the 10 function as ambassadors. When you have a minion of 10 Jews praying together, they become ambassadors for the Jewish people as a whole. And so Kodesh Baruch Hu relates to the minion as if it were a communication from the nation, not from 10 individuals. So by standing there and saying your words with 9 other men, you become part of an ambassadorial group. Just because there are 9 others there. Because they embody the character of the nation as a whole. So and that changes the importance of your own prayer. Your prayer becomes now part of an ambassadorial deliverance to the Creator, rather than just you standing there as an individual and talking. So here you see where becoming a part of a larger group then functions as enhances what you are. Similarly, there is a punishment, a heavenly punishment for certain types of crimes, very severe, the most severe of the heavenly punishments, which is called kares. Kares in Hebrew means to cut off. You can cut the branch off a tree. The meaning of it is, if a Jew does this purposefully and deliberately and so forth and so on, he's subject to this penalty of being cut off from his relationship with God. But every time but one, when it says it in the Torah, it says he'll be cut off from the Jewish people. That's what the words say. even though the meaning is being cut off from his relationship with God, the words say, be cut off from the Jewish people. What's the message? The message is, you don't relate to God on your own. You don't do that. If you think you can retreat to a forest and be solo and relate to God, the Torah is telling you, you're fooling yourself. You're dreaming. You're hallucinating. The only route for an individual Jew to relate to God is through Jewish people as a whole. That doesn't mean you lose your individuality, but it's only because you're part of this collective that you relate to God as a whole. Right? I mean, this is, of course, very grandiose, but think of playing football. You need a team of 11 men. You don't have, women can play football also. Yeah, you need 11 people, right? You need a team of 11 people, right? One is a quarterback, one's a fullback, one's a halfback, one's a distant receiver, one are guards, and so forth and so on. They play different roles, but if you don't have 11 of them playing all those roles, you don't have a team, and you don't have a game. So it's because you're one of the 11 playing your role in the context of another 10 that you form a team and you can play the game. Otherwise, you can't play the game. So it's the collective identity that gives your individual efforts the significance that they have. This is something which you have in Jewish thought to a very, very great extent. So this, together with the idea of doing being responsible for somebody else's mitzvahs, also means you're functioning as a member of a corporate group. Now, I'll give you a single example. Maybe we'll talk about this more tomorrow, where the individual. There are two. I'll give you the easier one. There's a statement in Chazal, brought several times. A person should say, "For my sake, the world was created." This is a Mishnah in Sanhedrin. We're talking to witnesses who are going to give testimony that someone committed a crime which is punishable by death. And we say to them, listen, think about what you're doing. You're giving testimony and someone might die. Think how important Jewish people are. Why was Adam created singular? So that each person should say, for my sake alone, the world was created. Just like Adam. It's true that for his sake alone, the world was created. That's what the Mishnah says. So the Maharal asks, wait a minute. At a certain point in time, Adam was alone. There wasn't anyone there. So of course, when he's absolutely alone, he could say, for my sake, the world was created. But when there are thousands or millions or billions of people, what does it mean that each one should say, for my sake, the world was created? Why would he say that? How could you make any inference from Adam, who was alone, to Jews or people who live in a world with lots of other people? Why is it similar? So listen to what the Maharal says. Maharal says, picture the world as it was being created before Adam was created. So you have the galaxies and the stars and space and time, and you have the earth and all its resources, and the animals and the trees and everything else. And ask yourself, what's the value of all that? From our point of view, the value of all that is zero. If it would suddenly cease to exist, there'd be no loss. There's no loss in losing daffodils. There's no loss in losing cows. There's no loss in losing galaxies. It has no meaning or significance. Now you put one person in, a person who can live a life of spirituality and morality, and that gives the world its meaning. It gives the world its value. It changes something from valueless to valuable. Just one person. And that's what the Mishnah is saying. The Mishnah is saying, when you speak to those witnesses and you say, you're giving testimony and this person might die, think what you're causing. You're causing someone to die. He, all alone, could justify a whole creation, just as Adam justified the whole creation. He's the kind of thing which all by itself could justify a whole creation. That sentiment is not treating the individual as a member of a corporate group. It's picturing him as not being a member of a corporate group. It's picturing him as being absolutely alone, individual, the only one. And still, as the only one, he could give meaning and significance and value to a creation which otherwise didn't have it. So here is a picture of the importance of the individual without being a member of a corporate group. That's one of the two. The other one I'll talk about tomorrow, Mitzvos Hashem. So the truth is we have sources of both kinds. And the bottom line is that, therefore, each individual Jew plays a double role, and it means, ultimately, in practical life, you often have to juggle your responsibilities. Because you have responsibilities for yourself, have responsibilities for your contribution to the whole, and sometimes they could conflict. The simplest example, this happens to some people who have the resources for it, a person who makes a lot of money, and he says, given the amount of money that I could make working 8 hours a day, I could support 500 Jews learning Torah. Of course, that with my other responsibilities would mean that I would have very little time left for my own learning. If I work 6 hours a day, then I could support 300 Jews learning, not 500. Then I'd have 2 hours to learn. Shall I give up my own learning as a whole to support more Jews for learning? Every hour that I work, I can support another 100 Jews learning. So, maybe I should never learn. Because every hour that I learn, another 100 Jews aren't supported. How do you balance your own responsibility? There is no such thing as, because I want to help other people, therefore I shouldn't learn. There's no such thing. Everyone has a responsibility to learn, but how do you balance it? And that's a very tricky kind of balance. And that happens with scholarship, and it happens with interacting with other people. It happens. There are lots of different balances here. And once you know that you have a double role, your individual role and your role as part of the Jewish people, you know that these questions have to be raised in your own individual life and have to be balanced. As you go through life, you get married, you have children, become part of a community. These valuations have to be made over and over and over again. It's part of living a life in terms of the richness of connections and responsibilities that you have. So we'll continue this again tomorrow in the session.